Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Jctr Corner, a program that is dedicated to the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflections and puts a focus on various issues that are under the center's focus. I am your host, Alice Maplanga, and on the program today, I have with me Miss Muchimba Siamachoka, who is the Jesuit Center's Social and Economic Development Program Officer. Welcome to the program, Miss Muchimba.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
So on the program, we are going to be looking at an overview of the budget and looking at the particular revenue measures that have been put in place in the budget. So Ms. Muchimba, last week we looked at the general overview of the budget and looked at the various allocations to the various sectors that are going to be looked at in this program. But maybe let's just break down the budget. What do we see of crucial importance to the effective implementation of the budget? We know the budget is at about 106 billion. And where do you say this money will come from if we are to effectively implement the budget?
So of crucial importance to effective implementation of the 2020 national budget is funding. And that's why the question that you have asked, where will the money come from, is a very key question. And I can compare this budget with last year's budget. We did see an increment from about 86.8 billion kwacha to 106.
Okay.
So given the current financial constraints, the question where will the money come from is very key. So government proposes to raise 106 billion kwacha, and this is from domestic revenue as well as external financing and external sources. So if I break down the component of domestic revenue, the proposed amount to be collected from ZRA, obviously, from the tax revenues, about 53 billion kwacha, and from the non-tax revenues, that is about 17.71 billion. Non-tax revenue speaks to government services, fees, and fines that can actually collect that amount. So for effective implementation to take place, what we are saying is government would need to put in strict measures to actually adhere to the process. A budget can be good on paper, but it's the actual implementation that remains key. So we did see the minister allude to certain measures that can be taken.
Okay.
And just to quickly run you through a few, we're looking at a continued rollout of electronic fiscal devices. So what we are trying to do is to reduce the human interface. Ideally, that is where the leakages are happening. So when we have this real-time data being transferred to these tax administrators, then we know that collection would definitely be robust and will cater for a lot.
Okay. Maybe before you continue, now you're talking about these domestic revenues that are amounting to about 71 billion.
Yes.
And we already know the financial constraints that we're in as a nation. Do you see a situation where maybe we are not able to mobilize these resources domestically? And would we then see us going to tend to the borrowing route and maybe borrow more on top of what we already have?
Okay, given the current economic challenges that we are facing, the likelihood to borrow more is present. And we need to be aware and likened to this fact. And the reason why we are saying so, even from the component itself, 106, if we're looking at collecting 72 billion kwacha, we still have a gap of about 31. But what will remain critical is government actually adhering to what has been put into place in the budget. For instance, we have the dismantling of local arrears to people who have supplied government with services and goods. That remains key, because if funding is not going to these local suppliers or the private sector, like we did see the private sector was crowded at, we have an economy that won't be growing in as much as we are trying to grow the economy. And also just to highlight, debt has created challenges in terms of prioritization. Mm-hmm. Last week, I'm sure as you were giving the overview of what debt has done, we can see that social spending has been squeezed. This has happened in this year's budget. We have seen education receive a reduced allocation. We have seen health receive a reduced allocation. And why these areas, as well as social protection, remain key is because the vulnerable in society are actually captured under those scopes. So we are hoping to see that ZRA is up to task. I know many times they've set their targets and they have met them. But the thing with the target, I could set it low to achieve it. I could set it high to have a greater impact in achieving that particular aspect.
Okay, so now you're talking about all these measures that have been put in place. One of the things that the government decided to do is to forgo the sales tax that was proposed and continue with the current tax system of the value-added tax. Do you think this is a step in the right direction?
Okay, the abandonment of the proposed sales tax system and the decision to actually focus on VAT is one that is economically rational as well as commendable. I think even in a household, changing a system takes longer to adapt, and the likelihood of the current administrative challenges being faced with the VAT system are likely to be faced if we had foregone and gone ahead with the sales tax. I know a number of stakeholders from the private sector, from government institutions as well, did allude to the negative impacts that would have been seen if we had gone on. For instance, we have a negative impact towards GDP growth. We also have the impact of job losses that would have come about because there would have been an elimination of intermediaries in the supply chain. For instance, in the mining sector, with the proposed sales tax, we would have seen the mines maybe opting to source their own inputs from outside. So then we have a large number of people who are supplying mines with various services. It could be from catering, it could be from copper cables, etc. So if those people are eliminated from those aspects, those are their livelihoods. So ideally, job losses would have been a challenge.
So would you then say maybe the sales tax in and of itself wasn't so bad, but maybe looking at our current economic situation, is it something that maybe towards the coming future we can look to adopting once our economy stabilizes and maybe our growth rate is bigger than the foreseen 2%?
I think in speaking to that, I would say the priority should be to fix the current loopholes that exist in the VAT system, and that's where we can reduce cheating as well as fraud and compliance. So these are measures that need to be addressed currently, other than moving on to something that we are not sure would or would not work out.
Okay.
Yes.
So other than that, a few more measures from the 2020 national budget have been the zero rating of capital equipment, the increased specific excise duty on cigarettes, and also the 20% increase of the carbon tax on all motor vehicles entering the country. How would you say each of these measures would benefit the Zambian economy?
Okay. Of course, where effort is being made, I think it is right to commend government for some of the steps that have been taken. So what I'll just do is maybe look at those few measures that we've isolated from the budget and just speak to them individually. So for instance, to start with the cigarette excise tax, excise tax are normally levied on goods that are deemed unnecessary in society. Some would call it the sin tax.
Yes, the sin tax.
For instance, we can talk about cigarettes, we can talk about alcohol, we can talk about gambling. So these are not good vices in society. So imposing these taxes in the first place is a good step, and the increment in itself has more of a dual impact. So on the other end, we are trying to generate revenue, increase revenue for government, and on the other side, on the opposite side of the coin, we are trying to reduce consumption of these various goods. For instance, cigarettes, we know the effects that cigarettes have on a human being, particularly to the lungs of somebody, is irreversible. So ideally, by increasing this excise tax, the cost will be passed on perhaps to a consumer. If I were to give a simple analogy, let me take a bottle of wine. A bottle of wine costs $10, for example, and we impose maybe a $2 excise tax. So the cost of that bottle of wine will be 12 kwacha to me, the consumer. And ultimately, in as much as the supplier will get their $10
Yes.
and pass on the $2 to me, people could say, maybe let me not buy wine because it's more expensive now. So there we see demand for that particular good going down. So the excise tax increase will have a significant effect on the reduction of smoking prevalences, as well as deaths that can be attributable to any smoke-related diseases.
Yeah, and of course you do then see a reduction in the spending on public health, in that you do reduce the amount that you spend on all these non-communicable diseases as a result of smoking or drinking related issues.
Certainly, I do feel it has a ripple effect. And as you've rightly put out, in terms of health as well, we can see people spending less to take care of these non-communicable diseases. Ideally, this should be managed by individuals on their own. And also, just to speak to that fact, if we increase specific excise duty on cigarettes, we are likely to reduce import competition. So the tobacco industry, if I can call it the tobacco industry, may become more competitive, and that is more revenue generated for government.
Okay.
Moving on, in line with the tax measures that have been proposed in the 2020 budget, we do have the carbon tax. I know a lot of people find this a little bit skeptical, but I think in light of the current challenges that we are facing, any step or any measure to look at environmental protection should be welcomed. But where more suggestions can be made, I think those should openly be put out. So in Zambia, we have a vehicle taxation mechanism, and government has already introduced certain taxes towards motor vehicles. For instance, I can talk about motor vehicles that are more than 5 years old. There's a particular tax that goes to them, and it's called the motor vehicle surtax, and it's a once-off tax. For any car that's coming into the country that is more than 5 years old, that particular tax is applied. And it should be collected by ZRA, mostly at the border posts, as these vehicles are coming in. Then the other tax is an annual charge that goes towards emissions. So this charge is paid by any car user, depending on the capacity of your size. So it's more or less like saying, what is the carbon footprint of a Toyota? What is the carbon footprint of a Corolla? It is the same with individuals. You have a carbon footprint and I have a carbon footprint. So I think these taxes are meant to minimize the effects, as well as to see what measures can be put in place to combat the challenges that will come up from those particular measures. So in looking at this particular tax increment, though it's not likely to affect the average lives of Zambians, I mean, not everybody is importing a car in and out of the country. I feel more could have been done towards environmental protection. There's need to isolate that cars are not the biggest emitters. They are part of the problem, but they're not the only problems. I mean, we have large-scale industries that do adhere to policies in place from the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, but more could have been done in light of the current challenges we are facing. I believe climate change is a very real issue, and real action needs to be made. And just speaking to that, the carbon tax that I mentioned earlier, the one that is applied to all vehicles annually, was introduced in the year 2006. So over a series of years, the other question that we can ask is what has been done with the funds that have gone towards carbon emission fighting, so to say.
Okay, so maybe you're talking about the fact that obviously carbon emissions do have a large impact on the environment, and we are seeing some of these effects. Unfortunately, one of the other effects that we ourselves are perpetuating is the issue of deforestation. So maybe would you say the need is for us to ask for more accountability in terms of what is that money being used for and where is it going? Of course, we are seeing the effects of climate change in that we're having less rainfall, which then leads to the fact that our water levels are dropping. That then affects our electricity generation, and we're having the long hours of load shedding that we're having. But then how do we ask the government to be accountable in the use of that money? And how maybe is the citizenry able to advise the government on what sort of initiatives can be taken to combat that?
Okay, I think just speaking to climate change, the fight against climate change is not one that is of the government on its own. I think as individuals, we all need to take responsibility to change our mindset towards certain things. Of course, I do understand it's difficult to ask somebody who has got no alternative sources of energy to stop using charcoal. You can't expect them to migrate from charcoal to something else that they cannot afford. But the reality is action needs to be taken. For instance, as I was mentioning with the funds that are being collected to combat climate change, there is need for serious ring fencing. That money should not go into a general pool and be applied to other expenditure measures, but it should go into a fund where we can see what measures we can take to combat climate change. For instance, if I'm to think off the top of my head, we have issues to do with research and development. Climate change currently in Zambia is mainly manifesting itself in reduced rainfall. So on the agricultural sector, I will talk about drought. But if you look at worldwide, sometimes it manifests itself in floods. We're not near a coast, so we don't experience drastic measures such as tornadoes, typhoons, hurricanes, but there is need to be prepared. So early warning systems would need to be invested into. And yeah, so to speak on that area, I think there's need to also encourage importation of cleaner and more efficiently used, for instance, for vehicles. We have these green vehicles. I don't think I've seen one in Zambia.
I don't think we're at that level yet where we're able to sustain the clean and green vehicles.
But I guess that the steps are steps in a positive direction, and this fight won't happen overnight. It won't. Some of the effects of climate change being felt today are as a result of actions that could have been taken 10 years ago. We talk about increased temperatures, all those things may be manifesting themselves now, but I think I should end there on climate change and the carbon tax. So just to reiterate, the step in the budget is a good move, but I feel more measures should have been taken to try and capture or just to strengthen the policies of fines that are around environmental protection.
Okay, so on that note, we will take a short break, but be sure to join us as we talk to Ms. Muchimba Siyamachoka on some of those revenue measures in the 2020 budget.
To advertise on this program and enjoy amazing introductory rates, please call us on +260 211 290959 or +260 211 290912 or +260 953 538 000 or send us an email at loyolazam@gmail.com.
Welcome back and thank you for joining us on the Jctr Corner. So before we went to break, Ms. Muchimba was simply talking to us about some of the measures that have been taken by the national government in regards to the 2020 national budget. So you've talked to us about the excise duty on things like cigarettes and also on the carbon tax on all the motor vehicles that are coming into the country. Yes. Maybe just speak to us about the zero rating of capital equipment. How does that work in benefiting the Zambian economy?
Okay, so just there are so many other measures in the budget. Just to allude, I think we're just picking out a few of them. So when we look at the zero rating of capital equipment, one would ask, what is capital equipment? So if you're starting a business, there's that initial investment that you make. So just a focus on the mines, because this mainly affects the mines. We're talking about that big machinery that is used to actually carry out the exploration works, to move their copper, etc. Just not to delve into that too much. So with the zero rating clause in the proposed budget for 2020, we are saying that this move is commendable. Not only will it encourage acquisition of this equipment, it will also just address the issues that have been characterized with the mining sector where it comes to VAT refunds that have actually over-accumulated over a period of time. So when the mine is able to bring in their equipment, they are not coming to claim for these refunds from the government. And if we are stimulating the mining sector in this way, we are increasing productivity. Ultimately, we're increasing the growth of that entire sector, and that means more revenue for the government. That also trickles down into jobs for people, so livelihoods are secured, and it would be actually nice to see how this actually rolls out during the implementation phase of the budget. But just to speak a little bit more on zero rating, we also have a zero rating that has been extended to the domestic supply of copper cathodes. And to mention a few other things, we have gas stoves, gas cookers, gas boilers. So this particular move is to allow people to bring in these equipment into the country. We're trying to change the attitude of Zambians. We're trying to cause a shift, like we spoke about before the break, from charcoal usage to alternative sources that are not actually affecting the environment as much as charcoal is. I mean, the charcoal, okay, the effects of charcoal are long-term, and if we're not deliberate about planting trees to the environment, then we have a challenge.
Okay, so what you are simply saying is that the zero rating of capital equipment is not only meant to increase revenue for the government, but also to reduce its expenditure on the tax refunds that you've spoken about that have made news in recent past, in that government is owing a lot of people in that. But then also, obviously, we have spoken about the fact that we need to change and find alternative sources of energy. Do you then say in reducing or in introducing the zero rating of capital equipment in regards to gas stoves and gas boilers and all of that. Do you think that's one way that the government is trying to encourage people to move from hydroelectric equipment that they've been using to maybe more gas-centered equipment, even in homes? Is that something that you think would then maybe bring a shift in the behavior of the Zambian people?
Yeah, I think looking at it from a long-term perspective, ideally that should bring a shift. I mean, if we are reliant on hydroelectricity, we find ourselves in the challenges that we are currently faced with. But for productivity to go on, we need to find ways to stimulate or to continue with the productive aspects in the economy. And at household level, we are trying to encourage the use of cleaner energy. And I feel there are a lot of lessons that we can learn as a country. For instance, we have Kenya that is leading in diversification of energy in Africa. I know in July, about July, they should have commissioned a windmill farm that is adding on to their national grid, and they're also leading where solar is concerned. So those are various other ventures that we can look at in the long term.
Okay. So another proposed non-tax revenue measure is the upward adjustment of various fees and fines charged by the government departments to cost-reflective levels. Does the Jctr feel this upward adjustment is justifiable?
Okay, so before I can speak to whether this is justifiable or not, I think there is need for governments to provide clarity on what particular fees we are looking at or what fines we are looking at, because it would be very easy to come out and say this is going to increase the cost of living for the average Zambian. But if I look at fines, a fine in itself is a charge that is paid when a law is broken. So if you break the law, you should be accountable to what you have done. So for instance, I can look at the road sector. We have a lot of road traffic speeding fines. I feel those are justifiable because we have measures in place. And also recently from most areas, I know the speed limit was 60 kilometers per hour, but because a lot of citizens came out and said this was not appropriate, it was upward adjusted to 80 kilometers per hour. So if we're looking at reducing accidents, for instance, maybe then we'll have less people trying to break the law or less people being offenders, so to speak. But if we look at fines, that can generally increase further the cost of living for people, that is not welcome. If we're looking at hospital fees, for example, I'm not saying it's hospital fees,
yes,
school fees going upwards, then we have a challenge because the cost of living is currently high and people are already failing to make ends meet. So on this move, in as much as this will actually increase domestic resource mobilization, what we are saying is the upward shifts should be cost reflective, firstly. And secondly, what impact does it have on the poor? I know the cost of living, or the cost of transactions for government has also gone up. For instance, a paper could have been 5 kwacha in the year 2005. I don't expect this paper to be the same price today. So there are some fees, yes, that have remained stagnant over a period of time. So yes, those fees may be justified, but further clarity is needed on what cost-effective levels we are talking about.
Okay, so you've spoken about the road transport sector and the fact that we have all these traffic fines and overspeeding fines. We already have seen where the government has pegged a huge sum of money in terms of their revenue from that. How do you then justify that? Because obviously the idea is what you don't want is people to be breaking these rules, but then if you put a chunk of your budget in terms of getting revenue from there, are we then maybe now just not asking people or hoping that people break these rules so that as a nation we make more money?
Not necessarily. I feel rules in any scenario have to be in place. Before they can be broken, they need to be in place because those parameters have to be set. I mean, if we left it open-ended and just speaking to the road sector, if Alice today you can drive however you feel like, if I can drive how I feel like, I mean, what probabilities are we looking at? I will hit into you, you will hit into me, and we will hit into so many other people.
And then we'll then inflate the public health bill.
Exactly. So lawlessness is not welcome. These parameters have to be in place. I feel where they are not fair to the common citizen, we can take the doors that are open to actually make our grievances heard. Okay.
So now, amidst all these economic challenges that we've spoken about and in regards financing our budget, the pay-as-you-earn threshold has been maintained at 3,300 kwacha. What do you think are some of the implications of this decision? Of course, we've had lobbying from various organizations and various departments in that there is need to maybe adjust this upward to about 4,000 kwacha, but it's been maintained at 3,300. What do you think are some of the implications of that, particularly on the average Zambian who is in the formal sector?
Okay, just to speak to the average Zambian, or to the very few people that are in the formal sector, I think what we need to realize, largely in Zambia, our employment is mainly informal. We have a lot of people that are in the informal sector, but for pay as you earn, this particular income tax, so to say, only the few formal employed individuals are the ones that are paying this tax. So our cry has for a long time been to lobby for the upward adjustment, because we are trying to give relief to these very citizens that are paying this particular pay as you earn threshold. So in giving them relief, we're also trying to stimulate economic growth. The theme of the budget is fostering economic growth, isn't it?
Yes.
I will not quote it directly, but that is what it's in line with. So if we are trying to grow the economy, ideally the citizens who are part and parcel of the economy needs to participate. So with the tax hold threshold, we have been lobbying for this to be increased. And the reasoning behind that is to give Alice more disposable income to demand for goods and services in society. So I feel an opportunity was missed here to actually give relief to citizens. We know with the current challenges that the economy is facing, and with pay as you earn being a big component of the tax revenue, maybe this is not the right time to speak to this, but I feel more could have been done because the cost of living is high. For inflation, for example, in the month of September, we had inflation run to a double digit of 10.5%, and this is as per CSO statistic. So what this is telling us is generally the price of goods and services has gone up,
higher.
and it was actually mainly attributed to food inflation, and that is easy to pinpoint. We're looking at maize. So we have a number of Zambians that are actually struggling with the cost of living in Zambia. For instance...
maybe before you go on, you've spoken about the fact that there's a very small percentage of the people that are in formal employment, and obviously the tax burden lies to that small percentage. Do you think maybe the government should be looking at broadening its tax base?
Definitely, tax broadening of the tax base is key, even for government. I know mostly when you talk about tax broadening, someone who is paying tax would feel, is that more taxes for me? But we can try to tap into the other areas that have not been captured well. For instance, we have the informal sector. We have a lot of unreceipted transactions that take place. So we have a number of people that can contribute to government revenue but are not currently doing so. And of course, even for them to contribute, incentives have to be in place. Incentives have to be given. If Alice, the owner of a salon somewhere in Chilenji, has to come on board to pay, there should be something driving you to want to contribute. Right now, you have your money with you. Why should you come forward and give government money? What are you gaining? But I feel we give a lot of incentives to multinational corporations that come into the country. A lot of foreign direct investment that comes into the country has a lot of tax rebates, tax holidays, etc. If we are able to give the same incentives to the Zambian locals, then we can see that we are trying to grow our own wealth. And ultimately, what we want to do is to move away from the over-reliance of stretching out to borrow, of relying on grants that may or may not come. So I think all these are areas where more can be expanded to see how we can stimulate growth, as well as give relief to the number of citizens in Zambia who are also struggling with the challenges that the economy is facing, and also the poor who are being the hard hit in the economy.
Okay, so you've spoken to that. I just wanted to bring to your attention your organization's basic needs basket survey that is done every month. Now, this tries to look at the cost of living, and the basic needs basket for the month of September for an average family of 5 stood at about 6,200. How do you think the average Zambian person will then be able to afford that, given that, one, there's been no upward adjustment in the pay-as-you-earn threshold, but then also we have all these economic challenges that are affecting the informal sector, in that people are no longer able to work. The same hours that they used to, either because of power cuts or because of the fact that they cannot afford the equipment that they need. How do you think, or maybe what advice would you give to the government in going forward? What do we need to do to be able to safeguard the Zambian people?
Okay, to safeguard the Zambian people, I think there's need to invest in the locals themselves, and there's need to see what other measures we can put into place to stimulate economic growth. I know there are a lot of, in doing so, definitely you need to identify what are your areas of growth, what are the low-hanging fruits, what is easier to reach out as opposed to longer-term measures. So I think a lot of measures have been stipulated in the budget, so adherence to these measures will remain key in stimulating economic growth. For instance, we can also look at revision of certain procurement acts, for instance, that will favor the local percentage of people. I know the Procurement Act should look at giving 20% of every investment that comes in should go to a local person. So in that, we are trying to stimulate growth. We are trying to provide employment to the people. I do agree with you, the cost of living, and the cost of living that we conduct is just a bare minimum. If we say 6,300, there are a lot of components that are not captured in here. For instance, clothing, and we're looking at basic needs that Zambian people can actually access.
Meal.
Exactly.
Fish,
so this bare minimum, the cost of living could be higher than this, for instance, in Lusaka. In the rural areas, it may be lower. Maybe the cost of transactions out there is less. So there's actually need to invest in the Zambian people. There's need to see what other revenue areas we can target. For instance, the informal sector that can bring on board something.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Siamachoka. It was nice having you on the program. That is the end of the Jctr Corner program. Be sure to join us again next week right here on Loyola TV. I am your host, Alice Maplanga. Goodbye.